Hi, my name is Abby Grabow, and the topic for my research proposal is genetic versus environmental factors that contribute to sex abuse perpetration. So, the background of my interest in this topic comes from my time spent in child welfare. This is currently my 13th year in child welfare, and in that time, I've encountered several cases of generational sex abuse in families, specifically families in which several members of multiple generations have been sex offenders. So I was very intrigued into how this happens. Is this environmental factors from being exposed to these behaviors, or is there a genetic component to this? So the two major theories pertaining to this matter are the behavior modeling theory and genetic modeling theory. So essentially, nature versus nurture. The behavioral modeling theory basically states that our behavior is the result of the interaction within our environment, including the patterns of behavior that we observe at home. These behaviors are learned and they're reinforced by classic and or operant conditioning. Additionally, abnormal or deviant behaviors, such as sex abuse perpetration, are learned in the same manner as societal, more socially accepted behaviors. Um, Conversely, the genetic modeling theory focuses solely on the genetic contributions to behavioral traits. So, why is it important to study this? First of all, is the prevalence of sex abuse. Um, though there are many, many types of sex abuse or sex crimes, we know that it affects many families, and both women and men are likely to have an incident of sex abuse at some point in their life, unfortunately. Additionally, sex abuse is a global and cross cultural phenomenon. Um, Information and data gathered for my paper came from studies performed in the United States, Canada, the Netherlands, the UK, Germany, Japan, and Italy. So this tells us that this is a cross cultural phenomenon. Um, Above all, we really need to gain insight for developing effective treatment for perpetrators of sex abuse. The more we know about the root causes, the more that effective treatment can be developed. So the design plan for my proposed research involves studying male sex abuse perpetrators. Now, I specifically chose male participants only because there is extremely limited data regarding female sex abuse perpetrators. In fact, in prison populations, women only account for 1 to 2% of sex offenders. So we are limiting my sample to males only. And I also chose to use males between age 12 and 50 at the time that they perpetrated. I limited the age and didn't go younger than that, even though there are incidents of sex abuse perpetration by males younger than 12, because sometimes there is some gray area between young children and what can be determined or what can be, I guess, classified as normal sexual exploration and body exploration versus a deviant behavior. So we wanted to make sure that we were only including participants that were acting outside the normal range of behaviors. So the methodology used for my proposed study is a mixed methods design. So I'm looking to uh, gather data through both quantitative and qualitative measures. So what I want to look at is the relationship between IQ, um, a perpetrator's childhood environment, a perpetrator's childhood experiences of trauma, which are measured by the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire. And I also wanted to get qualitative feedback from the perpetrator themselves. So the first tool I have chosen to use is the Weiss IQ test. There are two versions of it, one for adults, one for children. So anybody who is 15 or younger would use the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children versus the Intelligence Scale for adults. The benefit of using a standardized quantitative assessment is that it produces consistent and impartial numerical data. So the second quantitative tool that I propose to use is a Likert scale design questionnaire aimed to gather data about the participants' early life experiences. So the questionnaire would be designed to correlate a point score to responses, with higher point values being assigned to answers linked to trauma and exposure to negative environmental factors in childhood. So, for example, the statement might say, I felt safe around the adults in my life as a child. So your responses could be 1, always, 2, usually, 3, sometimes, or 4, never. That is how the score would be produced for that quantitative tool. So the third collection tool that I propose to use is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, commonly known as ACE, or to produce an ACE score. So this type of tool uses a dichotomous answer design. So each question is either yes or no, and point values are assigned to the yes or the no for each question. So at the end, the points are totaled, and a higher ACE score reflects a childhood with more experienced adversity, and higher ACE scores are associated with higher risk for negative mental and physical health outcomes. So that fourth tool that I'm looking to use to gather data on this sample is a qualitative questionnaire using open-ended questions, and it's aimed to gather information from the actual participant's unique lived experience as a sex offender. So these questions are designed to gather information about the physiological, emotional, and cognitive experiences of the perpetrator before, during, and after incidents of sex abuse. So, for example, I'm looking to gain information about, was this incident premeditated or a crime of opportunity? Prior to committing the offense, did the offender feel anger, sadness, intrigue, lust? And then what about after the act was committed? How did they feel? I'm really interested in gathering information about the sex offender to understand both similarities and differences between their psychosocial and behavioral patterns. So, my hypothesis going into this project was that there is a genetic component to sex abuse perpetration. That was really supported, again, from my work in child welfare on a specific case where a child was removed directly from the hospital as a newborn and placed into foster care, subsequently adopted, and this child has had no contact with his biological family. The biological family he was removed from had generational sex abuse with his biological father, grandfather, and several uncles all being sex offenders. The interesting part of this is that after this child was removed and went through puberty, I started observing these same type of deviant sexual behaviors in the child, meaning that there was more than just environmental factors, because he, in fact, was not in that environment with sex offenders. So that was very interesting to me. So again, why is this important to study and learn more about, because when we learn the root causes of sex abuse perpetration, we can develop effective treatment for the perpetrators, and perhaps understand what makes an individual more likely to have these behaviors, and even perhaps introduce some preventive education or therapy when we know that it's possible that genetically this individual has a higher likelihood of being a sex offender. Um, Lastly, as part of my hypothesis, um, I hypothesized that individuals that were participating in the study would their scores from their Likert scale questionnaire would correlate with their ACE scores. So the Likert scale was talking about different factors within their environment, and higher scores would basically reflect that they did not feel safe, stable, protected as child with all of their needs being met, and the ACE score reflecting higher adversity, higher exposure to trauma. The second part of my hypothesis was that these two scores would be correlated with one another. So finally, I wanted to touch briefly on some of the limitations of this study. um, I understand that when you use any type of non-random sampling, and in this case, this would be more purposive sampling to select your sample. This is not necessarily able to be generalized to the general public. Um, However, I am hoping that any information that could be gathered from this type of study could be generalized to this population or to individuals who come from families where there is a history of sex abuse perpetration. A second limitation is the fact that we really don't have data to compare female offenders with male offenders. Now, we do know that there are female perpetrators of sex abuse. However, it is so rare that it is very hard to have any sort of data or generalizable information from that. One third limitation that I'd like to note is that the qualitative questionnaire that I would use um, is really a self-report tool. So sometimes there is self-report bias when you're asking somebody to answer questions directly about their behaviors. Sometimes you get bias due to the fact that these individuals know what they did was wrong, and they may try to present information in a more socially acceptable response. Um, Additionally, self report is really constrained to somebody's memory of an experience. They could be talking about something that happened long ago, or sometimes traumatic experiences can be repressed, and so trying to gather that information and share that data might be difficult for them to clearly recall. So thank you to anybody who watches my presentation. I hope you found it interesting, and I am very open to any type of feedback or questions. Thanks so much.